Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Engaging Community and Building Economic Opportunity webinar. We have a great lineup of speakers, and so we want to go ahead and get started. Want to start off with a little bit of context. My name is Diana Zarzwell. I'm Senior Director of Strategy and Innovation for Neighborhood Centers. We're a regional community development organization located here in Houston, Texas. Each year, we serve about 600,000 people through a variety of services. At our heart and core, we are out of the settlement house movement, and so we continue to do community development work to this day, engaging and really partnering with low-income residents in low-income neighborhoods across Houston, and partnering with them over an extended period of time to really ask them what it is they aspire for themselves, their families, their community, and then bringing resources and partners to bear to create a community center that holds those services and resources that they've asked for. We have partnered with the Urban Institute on a variety of projects, but one of which included a paper called Expanding Access to Economic Opportunity in Fast-Growth Metropolitan Areas. And that really stemmed from a reflection on our own organization and sort of context. As we went to DC and other national platforms, we kept hearing over and over again that Houston was a very unique place, that our solutions in Houston were sort of very particular to our context. And we sort of pushed up against that and realized that we didn't think that it was true, that we thought that there were other regions that were facing similar challenges, having similar opportunities with similar demographics and economic contexts, that it was worth sort of looking at how we were similar and different from other regions. And so the Urban Institute led a research project that essentially looked at 14 different indicators and identified 15 fast growth metros. So those are Albuquerque, Atlanta, Austin, Boise, Charlotte, Colorado Springs, Dallas, Denver, Houston, Las Vegas, Orlando, Phoenix, Raleigh, Sacramento, and Tucson. So from there, we really started to use informally our networks with the Urban Institute and ourselves to reach out to other like-minded and impactful organizations in these different locations. And we see just sort of us organically creating a learning collaborative. And we see three major phases to this work. We're very much in the early phases, in the discovery phase, I like to call it. But we see as our first point of exercise that we need to agree on a collective foci, a structure and activities, if any, we want to do together. 2, building a network, a national conversation, and potentially sources of funding for our work in the regions that we're working in. And then 3, creating impact by attracting key partners in types of work that we want to pursue, in research, in policy, and advocacy that achieve our collaborative and collective goals as they are yet to be defined. So again, we're very much in the early phases of this work. We're currently working or focused on agreeing on what our focus should be and what our structure and activities should be, and we thought as a first step towards that is really engaging our partners in a meaningful way and learning in a meaningful way about the work that they've done and the success that they've seen in their particular regions. So we started off with a webinar and appreciative inquiry and our appreciative webinar, and now we are focusing on Charlotte with a great partner at Crisis Assistant Ministry and their partners in their region and talking about what they'd like to do. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Raquel, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Diana. Thank you, definitely. Thank you for the introduction. We are set up
Raquel, I'm going to do you a proper introduction. I just wanted to make sure you were there. Okay. So today's focus is on a compelling model of civic engagement in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I've been able to read a little bit about it, and it's incredibly exciting. the breadth and scope of partnerships that have really come to the table, so I'm personally excited to learn more. And our tour guide will be Raquel Lynch. She's Chief Program Officer at Crisis Assistant Ministry, the lead agency for emergency assistance for low-income families in Mecklenburg County, where Charlotte is located. She has over 14 years of nonprofit management experience with an emphasis in strategic planning and implementation. She leads projects and initiatives to develop the organization's infrastructure, including direct services and advocacy programs, as well as the development of volunteer programs. Raquel is highly experienced in development of civic engagement efforts with deep understanding and commitment to people-centered design. Crisis Assistant Ministry is Mecklenburg County's leading agency providing the working poor with emergency rent and utility assistance, clothing, household goods, and furniture. They're an independent nonprofit agency, and they focus on preventing homelessness and preserving dignity for Charlotte-Mecklenburg's working poor. With that, I will turn it over to you, Raquel.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you for joining us.
Appreciate it so much. Thank you for the opportunity. Today's agendas are good. We're going to take you through a great webinar. We have set out to actually go through the learning objectives, introductions, the initiatives that everybody will talk about, and we'll have time for Q&A. As Diana mentioned, Crisis Assistance Ministry is the lead agency providing the basic needs for families in financial crisis, and we do that through a variety of services. We do that through emergency rent and utility assistance. That's actually how we prevent homelessness. But we also provide clothing and household items for families in this community. The other role that we actually have it around education. This is actually where you find us. We really want to make sure that people understand why the families we serve are encountering crises. So we try to also utilize our expertise to educate people in this community. I want to introduce you to our speakers today. We'll have great speakers. Our guest speakers is our Assistant City Manager, Han Yi, Tracy Russ, who's the Principal of Solid, Denise Watts, who's the Superintendent of Project List. She'll talk and explain what that is, and Brian Collier, the Executive Vice President of Foundation for the Carolinas. As you have seen on the invitation, we have 3 specific learning objectives. We want to gain understanding of civic engagement, specifically as a tool for community change. We also want to understand more about civic engagement strategies and how their applications are used to further education and community opportunity. And what are the lessons learned from these 3 key local initiatives that were built to address community issues, utilizing citizen engagement. I have a question for anybody who is listening. What do you love about your city? Just one thing. If you were to think about that, what is the one thing that you love about your city? And if you think about that, think about what makes you connected to that community. Today, actually, we're going to tell you about our city, how it has a story, but a story of 2 different communities, in which we actually are a fast-growing economic booming city, but also through the past years, we also find ourselves understanding that there's a story, whether it is developed over and over into this understanding that we actually have 2 cities within one city. Whether it is through the initiative of Crossroads Charlotte in 2004, in which we talked and explore low interracial trust. The study of Project List, who actually said it in 2010, we did it in 2010. We did not have enough kids who were graduating at the levels that they should be. For today's story, which is about the fact that we are rating low when it comes to economic mobility. If we step back and we look at civic engagement, I think this cartoon says it well. I think most people expect their problems in their community to be solved at the pace of a superhero. If you think about superheroes, things get done quickly and we are solved. Every problem is solved. You know, when we highlight the fact that people have to roll their sleeves and be part of the solution, and it takes arduous work, and it takes time to fix things, or actually we have created. When we talk about civic engagement, we actually are talking about the way citizens in your communities organize to solve the problems they are facing as a community. Before that, I want to introduce you to someone who's going to talk to you from the city of Charlotte, where he sits. His name is Hanyi. He's the Assistant City Manager for the city of Charlotte. But before that, between 2004 and 2014, he served as Mecklenburg County Management and Budget Director. He was responsible for strategic planning, development of the county's $1.4 billion operating budget and the capital budget of the county. So he knows both from the county perspective, but also from the city perspective in his new role. What is the responsibility of the public sector? So we asked Hanyi to talk to us today and get us really started in thinking about what is the city's role in civic engagement. Hanyi, welcome.
Thank you, Rochelle. Good afternoon, America. It's Hanyi, and I'm an Assistant City Manager for the City of Charlotte. And I want to start by asking a question, probably two questions. And the first is, what makes a great city? And the second question to me related to that is, what makes a great life? And I will submit to you, excuse me, I will submit to you that the answer to both of those questions is the same. But let me just talk about the great city part of it, because that's what we're here to talk about. Sort of in the framework that I'm looking at, what you're seeing on the slide is, a great city requires two things. It requires reliable systems, and when I say systems, I'm talking about those big things that every city has: transportation systems, housing, water, electricity, public safety, all those big things that cities are responsible for. The second thing that I will tell you that a great city needs to have is empathy. Empathy, well, it takes many forms, but the difficulty with a city having empathy is that cities are inanimate objects. They are constructs. A city cannot be empathetic. Kind of present the problem to the model that I just laid out for you. What I will tell you is that a city may not be empathetic, but the people that live in the city can be empathetic. So a great city, the second axis, the x-axis, really means that the people that are living in the city are empathetic. Well, what does that mean? Empathy can be expressed as kindness. Expressed, if you keep moving down from low to high, ultimately as love. And that's, Raquel started with that question, what do you love about your city? And I think part of what the city's job is to do is to create that environment where love can foster. So if you look at this graph, reliable systems, empathy in the people, it really, that's the framework that I think we're going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about the systems piece, and the rest of the speakers are really going to talk to you about that x-axis. So if you go to the next slide, all the reliable systems in the city, transportation, roads, everything, all that does is really create a place that people can live. It's habitable. We're not creating the arts. We're not creating culture. We're not creating a kindness. We're just, it's just the infrastructure. It's a place where you can live. Clean water, low crime, all those sorts of things. That's the primary responsibility of the city, is to create a habitable place. Related to that is really the city has an interest in fostering or creating public spaces where people can get together, to be engaged with their city, not just their government, because usually when we talk about civic engagement, we're talking about engaging with the government. But really what we're trying to create is public space where the community can come together to do things that are important to the community. And that really takes us to this slide, which really, the role of the city is to create that fertile ground where others, nonprofits, arts and culture, churches, what have you, can really plant the seeds to make a city worth living in. And so that takes us to the last slide that I have before I turn it over to my colleagues, is that really providing an opportunity for empathetic organizations like the Foundation for the Carolinas, like the school systems, like the churches, to really commune and generate kindness. Our job is to create that environment where you're not worried about water quality, you're not worried about crime, so that other institutions and organizations can work in the city to really make it a place worth living in. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues here to take us through what that really means.
Thanks, Arlene. I also wanted to provide an introduction to Tracy Russ. who's here from Solid, and he was an integral part to an initiative that occurred here in 2004 called Crossroads Charlotte. And he'll talk to you a little bit more about that, but before about Tracy. Tracy Rose is an experienced strategist, communication executive, and an engagement expert with demonstrated success in defining and deploying innovative brand experiences. An interactive engagement process that builds value and enhances people and cultures within for-profit and nonprofit organizations and institutions, community, and advocacy efforts. In essence, when we're talking about Crossroads Charlotte and Solid, in essence, Tracy, we're talking about the work that we can do and really couching how do we talk about these issues. Tracy, can you take us through the step of first understanding what was Crossroads Charlotte, but also help us understand how branding was also helpful in communicating?
Absolutely. Thanks, Raquel, and thanks to Crisis Assistance and this network for hosting this webinar. It's great to be with everybody. You all look fantastic today. I'm going to tell you about Crossroads Charlotte, a little bit of background where it came from, which is important to understand, some of the lessons learned, and then I'll circle back to some of Hank's points around this idea of civic space. Crossroads was catalyzed out of a study that Dr. Robert Putnam from Harvard did in 1999-2000 that was an attempt to measure social capital as he defined it, meaning the number and health of connections among people, especially those unlike each other, differing groups. He used a series of indicators to do that across, I think, 40 communities. And you can see in the chart that Charlotte did great in terms of our levels of giving and volunteering. We were a very philanthropic community and levels of faith-based involvement. And it's important to know about this community anyway that those first two indicators are very, very closely related because many people do volunteer through their houses of worship. So that was the good news for us. The bad news was that in levels of interracial trust, we were next to the bottom among these 40 communities. Charlotte, as a community, does not like to be at the bottom of any list. It is, it's anathema to our civic identity to be last, and that has to do with our history and our culture. There's never been a natural feature here to make it an attractive city. It's not, there's not a big mountain range. There's not a beautiful lake or a coast. This community has been built literally on trade, commerce, and aspiration, and this idea that if you come here, you can do well, if you work hard, etc., which we'll figure back in later on as well. So the community saw this statistic led by Foundation for the Carolinas, Knight Foundation, and some others, and they said, well, we've got to do something about this. And there was a group convened, and this will be a familiar pattern to many of you across other communities of civic leaders, and their initial task was to design a response to this social capital indicator, meaning how do we increase our levels of interracial trust and move on up this list. What happened sort of in this journey to create those responses, which probably would have looked like programs, is that the steering committee decided that they would, for their own purposes, use scenario planning as a tool to possibly met out some responses. And they set about with consulting assistance to create 4 plausible stories about the community's future that were based in data and vetted by experts. So they were plausible, not predictive necessarily, but you can imagine that on one end of the spectrum there was a very, very bad future set out 10 years from that date. And on the other end of the spectrum, there were actually 2 good outcomes that were each different. You can see those stories at www.crossroadscharlotte.org. But you can guess from the names, Fortress Charlotte is bad, and Eye to Eye is good, Class Act is good, very different ways, and there's a middle one called The Beat Goes On, in which things are sort of the same, not so bad, not so great, but we didn't quite make it. This platform of storytelling and engaging people and organizations in a narrative framework actually became the core of Crossroads Charlotte. So what started out as a tool to design responses at a programmatic level became this, 8-year-long community civic engagement initiative that turned out to be very, very exciting. And I'm going to tell you from our perspective a few things that we learned about how to engage communities. Actually, if you could go back to the Imagine Our Tomorrow, yeah, there you go, thanks. And the first thing I'll say, and again, I am speaking from a branding communications perspective. At Solid, we believe you engage people well with competitive means, and by that I mean if you want people to care about your issue, your cause, your community, then the ways that they have to do that and to gain access to that have to be competitive in their everyday experience. There are some 45 companies that spend $1 billion each on marketing products. Most of us wake up from the time our eyes are open and our ears are awake. We're bombarded with choices that are largely driven by the consumer marketplace. I will say that the civic and social sectors have not kept pace with that rate of development, and nor that investment. And what gets most people in their heads when they think of civic engagement have something like a public hearing image in their head. So, and we've largely done that to ourselves. We've allowed that to happen, and we've allowed the consumer marketplace and the private sector to outpace choices in the civic sector. So what we do is to help people brand civic initiatives because we think that's important to affect change. With Crossroads Charlotte, I mean, you'll notice it has a name. It has a tagline, Imagine Our Tomorrow, Act Today, which not only is a tagline, but actually is the centerpiece of operationalizing what Crossroads Charlotte became. Imagining our tomorrow together through these 4 stories, and then providing ways for people and organizations to act, to pursue, and intentionally arrive in a desired future, not just arrive in one by happenstance. We can go on to the next one. Thank you. So these 4 stories were built out on a platform that provided multiple points of access into the story. So a website, that's what's featured here. But we also used civic engagement events, live events. We used poets, we used artists, we used film, we used visual arts, anything that you can imagine that normally exists in someone's everyday experience in front of their eyes and ears. We tried to deploy to engage people in these 4 stories and give them tools from which they could then act. So the whole idea of this was that we wanted to leverage the power of networks and leverage partnerships to engage as many people, as many organizations as possible in this effort. And what ended up happening was that over 40 organizations designed and then implemented their own responses in terms of building the tomorrow that we wanted to arrive in, that were inside their missions, serve their self-interests, but also allowed individuals to connect with each other and then within the community to act as well. So what you're seeing here are examples of programs that were deployed under the Crossroads Charlotte brand umbrella, like Get Real, like Many Cultures, One Community, Know It to Work It, Art in the AM, Exchange Sermons. These are all brands that were built and deployed out to the community to engage people in ways that were familiar to them and places that were familiar to them, but meant to be competitive in the marketplace of overall choices. And we can go to the next one. We built a platform through which people could connect, communities and organizations could connect, and I would say, when Hunk references the value of civic spaces, we tend to think of parks and squares and these kinds of things that are physical spaces. And what Crossroads did was to create this civic space that was both physical and virtual, and allowed our community to not only address issues of equity, access, inclusion, and equity at the heart of social capital, but also along the way we learned that we could use it to respond to a number of other issues. When schools were closing in neighborhoods that people were upset about, Crossroads Charlotte was the platform that the community used, and other issues like that. So we can go to the civic infrastructure slide. Next one, got it. And I'll end on this slide and talk about this idea of civic infrastructure, and again picking up on this idea of the public square. Our agency lives and dies on civic initiatives. That's what we specialize in. Having said that, Investing in civic infrastructure that is enduring and sustainable, meaning that the structure stays in place regardless of the issue, I think would be my #1 recommendation for this group to pay attention to. That means people, facilitators, communicators, funders, platforms for engagement, programs and for participation, so that you're not recreating this wheel every time an issue comes along. And you'll see from our own history even that we tend to be responsive in that way, and we have been well responsive. We're lucky to have a community foundation as an example, and organizations that care and will engage. But having that infrastructure in place before the issue arises, before the opportunity comes in front of you is important. So pay attention to that. Think about civic infrastructure in all its dimensions, and remember to brand it to be competitive and brand it to be an ask that's actionable by people in the community.
Thank you, Tracy. This is excellent. We really want to think about what are the ways in which we organize, but also we want to think about what are the spaces that we can build for this community to engage. We're going to switch gears to talk about another project. Denise Watts is the superintendent, the Learning Community Superintendent for Project Lift. Denise, I want to really help you understand how much of a jewel she is for this community. She brings a history of educational leadership to her role. She has a lot of experience, and I will say, in understanding how this community organizes itself. And she'll talk through that. More importantly, she has a variety of educational experiences, from being a teacher to being an assistant principal to being a principal herself. And it's interesting because now in her role, in which she is in a project that is within the educational district, it's partnering with our what we are going to call Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. If you hear her say CMS, is what she meant. It's the Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system, which is one of the largest in the country. I want to just thank you for the opportunity to share with us what Project Lift has meant to you, but also to help us understand how this project was initiated by people who care about children in Charlotte.
Absolutely. Thank you, Raquel. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to share with you about Project Lift, a project that's very near and dear to me and hopefully will leave a lasting legacy in the great city of Charlotte that I love so much. Project Lift, L-I-F-T, is an acronym. It stands for Leadership and Investment for Transformation, and it began about 5 years ago, and I would say inspired partly by Jeffrey Canada and his talk to the city of Charlotte about how the work in the Harlem Children's Zone had advanced educational outcomes. Here in the city of Charlotte, as you've heard Tracy speak, we have a very benevolent group of businesses and groups of people who have always given to public education, and after hearing Jeffrey Canada speak, decided that they were going to collaborate around this idea of how they could strategically work to advance student outcomes in their education giving. So what manifested from that was engagement with the school district, engagement with the larger community, around what could a project look like that would support public education, educational outcomes for students who were the most academically disenfranchised, if we all work together in doing so. Formally, Project Lift was born around 2011, 2012 when I was hired, and what we know it today as is a public-private partnership between Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools and the Project Lift Governance Board. And it's pretty unique around the country just how both of these entities are working together. But the project specifically focuses on 9 schools in the West Charlotte corridor, and it was the aim of the investment study group to, instead of going wide with their philanthropic giving, they really wanted to test this idea of going deep with their philanthropic giving and focusing on 9 schools that at the time had the greatest need in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. West Charlotte High School at that point in time had a graduation rate of about 51%. And considering the fact that about 20 years ago this high school was the flagship of Charlotte in its efforts around school integration, where our very own Mayor Anthony Fox graduated from West Charlotte was the pride, the jewel of this community, had now seen itself on the other side of that and was one of kind of a sore spot in the community. So the group, the public-private partnership really centered around this particular high school and the schools that feed into it, making it a pre-K-12 feeder pattern. When I think about the civic engagement that really allowed Project Lift to advance, I think about the work that happened between 2010 and 2012, because we had some very critical, pivotal points that occurred. First, in 2010, you had Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools, the Levine Foundation, and the Spangler Foundation to first kind of sit around the table and begin to think about this idea of what could happen if we strategically work together in our education giving. Very quickly garnered the support of Foundations for the Carolinas to kind of bring everybody around the table and make that conversation more productive and formalized, and creating the investment study group, which brought in some additional community leaders to really study these ideas around education reform across the entire nation. And then you had this very important step very quickly to involve the broader community. So those were the stakeholders closest to the community that we were aiming to impact. I was hired late in 2011, and then there were some very pivotal points in which we kind of formalized the agreement with Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools and created this collaboration agreement, so to speak. So that's one of the things, this idea of a collaboration agreement is one that when I talk about Project Lift at a national level, people find to be most interesting because it actually lays out the governance of how the public and private partnership works, so that as the project has evolved over the last 3 years, we're on our 4th superintendent now. We've had changes in school board members. So there's been lots of shifts in key leadership positions. However, we've stayed very true to the mission and vision of the Project Lift work. And so one of the lessons learned that I would say has been very important in the evolution of Project Lift is this idea of formalizing the partnership with a collaboration agreement that outlines how the two entities work together. Project Lift focuses on 4 key areas: talent, time, technology, and community and parent support. I'm going to actually go right into engaging the community and the parents because that's probably one of our hardest key levers, but one of the ones that bring us the most joy and the one that we feel like will be important in the sustainability of the program. So we've really worked hard in going into the community, empowering parents, renewing trust, and providing the support that emerges because of circumstances of poverty. One of the programs I'd like to highlight is the Getting Ahead program. And through working with the parents that you see pictured here, we were able to get several of these parents employed, mental health services that they need. Many of them finished their diplomas or moved on to training and post-secondary opportunities. While that is not directly happening within a school building, we know for sure that it plays out in the lives of our children because the homes now are more stable, parent needs are taken care of, and so they can better support their children when they arrive at the schoolhouse door. We've also been extremely successful around bringing community resources such as the first pediatric dental clinic in the nation. Novant provides a cruiser that provides health services to our children and our families, again, all supporting the academic success of our kids indirectly. One of the things I'd like to highlight is that while we've had changes and transitions within the school district leadership, the Project Lift Governance Board has been consistently committed to this work, and they have remained in place, every single person except for the mayor of Charlotte, and we give him some grace since he has now moved on to a position at the White House. Lessons learned from Lift. So leadership matters. One of the great things that we've had as a part of our work is the fact that the current superintendent, as well as myself and the Lift Governance Board, have been consistent from day one. I would say don't lead with money. Invest in a strong media strategy. take a learning stance. I've been so impressed with the Project Lift Governance Board, again, many of which are business leaders. They have not approached this as at an angle of what are we going to do. It's what can we learn and how can we better impact the work in the schools in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. And then just as a last piece, I would say start with the end in mind. As you look at the last couple of slides, the vision of Project Lift is alive and well in the work that we do every day. 3 years ago, these 3 students I could observe outside my office window on any given day. Trouble found them. They were all arrested at some point in time, dropped out of school, and because of the vision and mission of Project Lift and the commitment of the people that are working to advance education, I can now look at the faces of these 3 young men, and they look totally different. And what they bring to us is hope and the fact that they will now be positive contributing members of Charlotte. So very excited, and I appreciate the time to share our work with Project Lift.
Thank you, Denise. It's really inspiring way to talk about the community that we serve today. More importantly, how do we actually create a future for the children that we want to talk about? I think something you highlighted that I want to make sure we capture at the end is also this idea of two-generation approaches, that we cannot solve education without actually addressing the needs of those parents. So thank you for that. I want to switch gears and talk about the common denominator between all of us, which is Brian Collier. Brian Collier is currently serves as the Executive Vice President for the Foundation for the Carolinas, which you have heard mentioned several times here today. The Foundation for the Carolinas is actually the 9th largest community foundation in the United States. And I know it's actually probably a low figure, but it's worth over $1.7 billion in assets. I'm sure it's more than that, right, Brian? Today.
Work it up.
So I know that Brian also has served actually in his role in the foundation to make sure that there's a lens for civic engagement and civic leadership. And he's done that through overseeing the role of all the initiatives that you heard today, Project Lift, Crossroads, and what you're going to hear about from him today, which is the Opportunity Task Force. With that, Brian?
Thank you. Thank you for those kind words. So if we think back, the foundation was connected to Project Lift. It was connected to Crossroads. We've also had a number of other initiatives in the community around housing and other things that I think we're feeling very good about ourselves, probably in 2012 and 2013. We were proud of our investments. We thought we were making major change in the community. I think when people think about this community, Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, a lot of people are moving into this community for opportunity. They move from someplace else. They move to Charlotte thinking that cost of living is a little bit better. It's a beautiful city. It's got great opportunity. And so, again, I think we here at the foundation and our partners were feeling relatively good about ourselves. And then in 2014, a gentleman by the name of Raj Shetty, many of you probably have seen the data so far, but Harvard and Cal Berkeley looked at 50 communities around the country and looked at this issue of upward mobility. In other words, how likely is it that a child born into low income and low poverty has the ability in that community to move to live the quintessential American dream? In other words, move from the lowest quintile of income to the highest. And when they looked at the communities around the country, I think we were all shocked to see that Charlotte ranked at the bottom. Now, you can look at this map and you'll see that the Southeast as a whole is pretty bad. And there are pockets in other parts of the country, certainly. But we were shocked that this place that we had come to love and really believe is a land of opportunity was at the bottom of the barrel. And as Tracy mentioned earlier, I think one of the things that galvanized the community was this idea that Charlotte does not like to be on the list that is bad at the bottom. And it really started to get everyone thinking about, well, what's this data telling us, and how might we as a community respond to it? So just quickly on this, when Dr. Chetty looked at this information, they came up with these 5 predictors for opportunity around the country. They are segregation by race and income, the level of income inequality in a community, school quality across the entire district. Almost every district is going to have pockets of great schools and pockets of low-income schools and low-performing schools. But how does the district perform across its entire region? This idea of social capital, again, looking at the Putnam study, and family structure, teenage pregnancies, unintended pregnancies, single-parent households, all of those things kind of go under that family structure umbrella. And when we looked at this, the predictors, we started to say, wow, the foundation has been moving in all of these areas, but we've never had sort of an umbrella to pull them all together. So we thought maybe this idea of mobility and opportunity does pull it together. Let me give you a couple of just little background slides on why we felt like this was really strong evidence for our community. This is a map of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County, which Charlotte and Mecklenburg County are pretty much synonymous for our community. They're smaller towns, but pretty much synonymous. And when we look at a community of almost 1 million people, you can see the blue area is white, the greenish and yellow, they mix in at this level, but it's that's African American and Hispanic, and red is Asian. You can see this heavy level of concentration and segregation by race, and I'll show you some other stats in just a minute, but that blue area down there in that southern part of the pie there is what we call South Charlotte, and very white and affluent. And then you've got that crescent of what looks like green and yellow as being low income and minority for the most part. So this really indicated to us again that we've got a segregation by race issue, but also when we start to look at some of the other charts, we found that we have strong income inequality. So these are essentially mirror image maps of Charlotte, and you can see on the left-hand side those are households above 200,000. So you can see again that wedge appearing down in the south, and a blob up there at the very top. But you see that white area above the area in the bottom. You see that that's again an area of concentration of poverty. And then if you flip the chart over on the right-hand side, again you'll see very low poverty in the south. Go back just one second. Very low poverty in the south section, and then higher poverty in that crescent. So this begins to tell us a story that repeats over and over again. Again, you'll see this in the slide here. This tells you about children born into poverty, very low poverty in our southern portion of the community, and then again this high crescent of poverty for children of color. And so this starts to tell us things that we really need to look at in the community. On the next slide, again that crescent appears when you look at school quality. So remember all of the predictors, because many of the community said that information is not true. This is not the Charlotte that we know. But when we started looking at all these maps, it did start to tell this story in what we've called this tale of two cities. And here you can see poverty by school. So back in 2001, we had very few schools that had both high concentration of poverty and high concentration of segregation by race. Very few back in 2001. And now you see the map in 2013 where we have a majority of our schools in our district are both highly segregated by poverty and by students of color. And again, you see that wedge down there in the bottom where you have almost no schools where you have poverty and students of color. So this started telling us the story that we wanted to react in the community. We wanted to first find out, is the information accurate? And then what do we do with this information? So we, in sort of picking up on what we had learned in Crossroads, and certainly what we had learned through Project Lift, we decided that we had to engage the community in a meaningful conversation in order to get at the root cause of some of these issues, and then develop a number of recommendations that are actionable. So not just a book that sits up on a shelf, but something that we can do something with. So in May of 2015, we launched the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Opportunity Task Force. You can see here the members. You can tell they're diverse by pictures, but what the pictures don't tell you is that many of these members have their own opportunity stories. So someone that you might look at up there and think, well, that's a white, wealthy individual, has an interesting opportunity trajectory. They were born into poverty and have overcome that. And we have others from that represent our Hispanic population, African American, women, faith sector, business sector, everything that we could sort of think of in order to really be representative of the community. So one of the first things we had to talk about was this issue of economic opportunity and how we define it. So if you go around the country, you'll hear people talk about upward mobility, poverty. Some people will land on poverty. Some will talk about social mobility. We actually decided to call it economic opportunity, and for a very specific reason. It's hard for anyone right conservative or progressive, it's hard for anyone to argue with this idea of opportunity, that every child, no matter where they are born, should be able to, hopefully by pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps or through the help of others, they are able to have that American dream. So once we landed on this idea of opportunity, it sort of had a bipartisan sound to it. And so we have not called it mobility and things like that, because mobility actually sort of assumes that you're going in one direction, and we're talking about people moving into middle income and staying in middle income at the very minimum. We've also received outstanding support from the folks at our city and county, as well as a number of the foundations here in the community. All of them are very interested because they've been doing work in this area but have never really looked at it from this opportunity lens. One of the first things that you as your community have to think about when you're talking about opportunity, I'm not going to go through each of these, but you have to start talking about, what do you mean by opportunity? Do you mean shared prosperity across the community? Do you mean a strong middle class, no child in poverty, an absolute meritocracy? All of these things are very important because the definitions really matter. They matter on how you talk about this, but they also matter in terms of the recommendations that are going to come out from the exercise. So to help us think through this, we've been looking at key resources from across the country. Our leading partners right now are the UNC Charlotte, who's helped us with data, and certainly with Brookings Institute. We've been working very closely with Brookings and with Pew, and here's all of the experts that we've worked with. One of the things we'll be doing is going out into the community, bringing these national and local experts to the community so they can hear from them firsthand, and we have community dialogue. Here you see a packed house. One of the things that we're working on, one of the first things we have developed is this sort of a framework for how we're looking at this. Again, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but we're looking at what are the system changes that need to occur, how do you influence the community in order to make stronger communities for these individuals. Certainly the family issue and skills and structure and family planning. And then it all comes into that individual. Certainly part of it is how do we help that individual, but then how does that individual take the opportunity structure that's in place, hopefully with very minimal barriers, and go forward and achieve through this community effort. Just real quickly, I wanted to touch on how we're going out into the community. We have, with the help of Tracy Russ here, we've looked at how do we get people, engage them where they are. So some of it through social media, other pieces of it will be in-person meetings. Certainly we have a website that we'd love for you to go onto, which is opportunitysharmec.org. And then we're really trying to help people sort of meet them where they are. So here's our website. We've had in-person events. We're doing community town houses, town meetings, and things like that. And then we've given them sort of 3 things that they can do right now. So they can sign up on our website. They can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, which I hope all of you do as well. And then take what they've learned and then have hopefully either neighborhood meetings, or we're developing a toolkit for them to be able to do stuff in their own neighborhoods or in their churches to really get involved and understand how this these are really big questions. And they really are a common thread through so many issues in our community. And just lastly, I just have a photograph here of our co-chairperson, Dr. Ophelia Garment-Brown. And these church meetings like this one here have been so powerful because it touches on the issues of segregation, school assignment, scarcity of resources and how they're allocated. And so we've really tapped into an amazing amount of community support to have a discussion. Now, when we announce the recommendations next year, by laying this groundwork, our hope is that we will have prepared the ground enough for people to have intelligent, rational conversations. But, these are going to be difficult choices that the community is going to have to make next year. And we're looking forward to keeping you engaged and up to date on where we go. So thank you.
So back to me. I started it. I'm going to close it. So what does this all mean for this question that we started with of what makes a great city? So if you think about the systems in the city, water, transportation, everything, as just big balls of stuff, and you drop it into a bucket, there's space between those balls. And those reliable systems, every city has it. Every city has highly reliable systems. So if you're thinking about a great city, those aren't differentiators. It's not on the system side that you're going to get really a great city. It's on that other axis of empathy. And it's in those spaces between the balls, where things like the foundation, there are people like Tracy Russ, where things like Project Lift, the foundations, the churches, the arts and culture, everything, those things exist in those spaces. That's really what makes the city great. And if you think about Charlotte, what you've heard are, I think, some uniqueness to how we approach problems here. The first thing that you would have heard is that when we approach a problem, we collaborate. It's not just the public sector deciding to do something, or the churches, or the nonprofits, or the businesses. It is a collaboration of the public, the private, the nonprofit, and other sectors, whether it's academic, or the churches, or the religious community, all of that. We tackle these problems together. That, I think, is a unique differentiator for Charlotte. The other things that I will mention are things like the civic infrastructure, the creation of places where these conversations can occur, that Tracy talked about. Those are important spaces in the city for people of different backgrounds to come together and actually think through these problems. And the latest being the Opportunity Task Force is a good example of that. We talk about how we work together and having these written agreements between different bodies so that we all know what our roles are and we all are moving toward the same thing. These are all important things that we do. Not just as one-off things, but this is the regular method of how we operate as a community. And I think the last thing, which is probably very important, is that as we approach these problems, whether it's interracial trust, whether it's education or economic opportunity, what you're seeing is a thoughtfulness in how we approach these problems. We don't react. Oh my goodness, we're 50th. We need to do something right now. Let's throw some money at it. Problem, we declare victory and we move on. And we're spending over a year just looking at economic opportunity before we decide what we want to do. That is, I think, incredibly unique in terms of the communities around the country. And that, I think, really makes us stand out. There is a thoughtfulness in how we approach our problems. It's not a reactionary thing. It is a very well thought out approach to understanding the nature of the problem, the strategies to address the problem, and then actually implementing those things. And that gets us back to sort of that x-axis of empathy, which we're really seeing in this community. And I don't think it's a city thing, it's a community. It's this movement from low empathy to high empathy as we begin to understand problems and issues that confront us, and we work to address it. You're seeing this movement as we interact with each other towards greater kindness, greater understanding, and ultimately what I think makes for a great city and a great life, which is finding love in the community that we are a part of and embracing it and loving it and taking ownership of it, which is what you see with things like Project Lift, Crossroads, and the Economic Opportunity Task Force. So with that, back to Raquel.
Thank you, Handy. That's beautiful. This is the time for questions and answers. If there are any questions from the audience, we will take it at this time. At the same time, I have some questions for the panel, so we could get started there. I know that we talked a lot about the way the community organizes, but I wanted to hear about from some of you about what do you think is possible for as we are growing as a community, and we have a new generation of people who are young and who want to participate in the change that we want to create. So one of you wants to talk to me about the way that we engage the new generation of millennials who are moving to Charlotte faster than we can take, and actually in the same time, how do we engage them as their newcomers to the community?
If you don't mind, I'm going to take this one because I view millennials as my summer field research project. And I'll be honest, I spend a lot of time at bars during the summer because that's where they congregate, apparently. But when I look at how the city is organized, I really break it into two parts. There is what I call the institutional layer. You're talking to it right now. All of us in this room are part of that institutional layer, the existing power structure in the city. The difficulty with millennials is that they are not in that layer. They are a part of what I call the revolutionary layer. There's a lot of energy, there's a lot of activity, but they have great ideas, but they don't necessarily know how to access the existing power structure to get their ideas in front of the people who can actually do something with them. So That's been my research. How do I couple all this energy and activity and creativity with the existing power structure, bring it together to get something done? And really, it's trying to, you got to meet them in their space. They're not going to come to you. So you have to get out there, whether it's field research, meeting them in a bar, inviting them in, which I've often had to do, is invite them to breakfast, lunch, dinner, happy hour, whenever I could, to create a space where they're willing to have a conversation about what it is that they're trying to do and how I can help them achieve what they want.
Thank you. I just want to make sure I give an opportunity for those listeners to ask a question. You can type your questions. We will read them out for you. I have one question for everybody who has talked today. We have not talked specifically about outcomes, because today is not about outcomes, it's about civic engagement. But if you want to highlight what is the most positive outcome so far from Project Lift, from Crossroads Charlotte, or for the Opportunity Task Force, and it doesn't have to be about the program outcome, but what are the things that you have actually observed so far?
Sure, I'll take it. This is Brian. And if I think about with the Opportunity Task Force, so they started in May, and they're now in, they've had 7 or 8 meetings. They're meeting every 3 weeks, by the way, in case you're wondering how we structurally set this up. They're meeting every 3 weeks through October of 2016. And what I've found very interesting is most of the task force members came to the committee, or came to the task force with their own ideas about how to move mobility, how to help particular groups across the community. And some of them had very specific things, like we need to get jobs for 18 to 24-year-old African-American males who are outside the workforce. And what I love is that they have not let go of those ideas, but they have started to see how other things in the community impact a child's life perhaps much earlier, rather than creating programs that are trying to be very remedial at 17 or 18 or 20 years old, how early on you might have intervened with more nursing programs, like in-home nursing programs, or child literacy, or things like that. Certainly having the idea of a navigator for a child in middle school and in high school, so they know about college and how to fill out forms and apply for the FAFSA, things like that. So I've been very, very happy that people have sort of come along with us and brought their own ideas but adapted the others. The other piece that I'm really proud of them is that we're having very candid and sometimes very raw discussions about race, and those are sometimes between, say, African-American leaders and white leaders on the board, but sometimes intergenerationally between leaders who are much younger than others and sort of have a different, so 2 African-Americans who are very different in age have a very different viewpoint of some issues. So those kinds of discussions have been incredibly powerful, and I think that's the only way that this will get sold into the community, is for us to be able to point to the fact that we tackled some of these issues and that we had really strong conversations. And obviously the next phase is to take those conversations into the community, to have the general public's opportunity to respond. But those are the 2 things I would point to as early wins.
Denise?
Sure, I can add, I think initially I told you the graduation rate at West Charlotte when we started the initiative 5 years ago was 51%. We are now at 76%, so that's a 22% increase. And we've also seen several of the initiatives that started in LIFT now expand beyond the 9 schools and are being adopted by other schools in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. So those are 2 things that I would raise up as important success stories to our work.
I'll add to that. This is Tracy again. 2 things. One is that the community, as Brian referenced, has learned, and Hung has referenced, has learned a new way of addressing issues and opportunities. We collaborate, we build platforms for engagement. We know that it's important to get people involved early. So, I think, I do not think that Project Lift would look like it does now had it not been for Crossroads Charlotte. I don't think that the Opportunity Task Force would be focusing on citizen and resident engagement like it does without Project Lift. So these things build on each other, and that to me is a legacy outcome of a way of doing things, not a programmatic outcome. And the second thing is, this idea of engagement of millennials and even younger. I think it's as much about allowing space for those younger generations to try, to prototype, to innovate, and at an institutional level, very much a willingness on the part of those institutions like local government and like funders to raise the risk tolerance for failure, because that's how millennials think. The world for them has revolved around innovation, revolved around quick prototyping and iteration. So if something doesn't work, they go right on to the next one. If you don't allow for that, you're essentially squeezing out the innovation factor from your civic structure. So I think we're getting much better at that, and we're fortunate to have local government and funders and leaders, individuals in those institutions and structures that understand that and are willing to raise that tolerance level.
Thank you, Tracy. We have one question from one of the listeners, and the question is, are there any civic engagement strategies that you ruled out in any of your initiatives, things that you did not want to do, and maybe you could answer why?
Well, I'll say one of the things that we were given very early in the Project Lift work was legislative flexibility to change the school calendars. We're the only non-public schools in the state of North Carolina that have that flexibility. I wanted very much so to do that with the community and not to the community. Coming off the heels of school closure and the excitement that the Project Lift Board had around getting this new legislative power to be able to do something different with school calendars, it was rather tempting to just go in and say, we're doing it in all 9 schools. Because the district wanted us to do that. It was something that we had tried to get for years and years, and now we had the power to do it. But I'm thankful that we exercised our power to do that very carefully, and it was a conversation. I can remember going to the high school and talking to the parents about wanting to implement a year-round calendar and almost getting run out of there. They did not want any part of it. And it would have been easy for me to say, but we're doing it because it's what's right for kids. But I wanted parent voices at the table to inform what's right for their kids, not me telling them what I thought was right for their kids. So I would just say I'm not sure if it directly answers your question, but we ruled out just doing a blanket implementation of a strategy that we all felt was a good thing without getting parent voice at the table.
The second part of that question, I think there was a little one after that said, or things that we tried that failed. And I can't think of too many things that have been absolute failures. I think the piece that we struggled with from Crossroads to Lift to Opportunity Task Force is how do you get voices at the table who are beyond the choir, who are the people who have a thought about this, but they don't feel comfortable going into certain settings, or they feel like those are the foundations and the powerful, and I can't go in there and say what's on my mind. I know we've struggled with that with all of these initiatives about how do we scratch our heads thinking how do we go to, I think Denise, you went to a bar or something like that, where it's laundromats. Wherever we need to go, we keep trying to get people and trying to engage them. But I would say we're still really getting authentic community engagement is a real struggle, and we just keep throwing stuff against the wall all the time.
And how do you measure it?
Yeah.
So that's the other piece of it. Like, we can all say people were engaged because 100 people showed up. That's not a true measurement of engagement and what the implications or the consequences of that engagement, how that will play out in the future. It's just very difficult to wrap your brain around it, how to do that and document it so that you have institutional knowledge of how you did the work.
Thank you. This is actually a question that's coming that I think actually talks a little bit about measurement and actually how do we actually create impact. But to what extent these initiatives are used in or not used in the framework of two-generational approach, like the fact that we actually can talk about the generation of children and the parents, and also collective impact, the fact that we're actually working together as a community towards the same goal and measuring together that progress. You talk about Crossroads, up to what extent do we actually talk about collective impact?
So, you know, in many circles and rooms kind of like this one, we would call it collective impact, and it weighed heavily in the entire strategy. And, you know, out on the street, we would say, you know, can you see yourself in this story? Meaning, you know, from the private sector, you know, what does it mean to your employees, to your bottom line, to your stockholders, for you to invest in this community and see yourself? To local government, what does it mean to constituents, to voters, to funders? You know, what does it mean for stakeholders and fund holders, and you know, your mission? So very much, I'd say in all three of these examples that collective impact framework is right at the center of the design and then the implementation of the strategies.
Can you talk about a little bit, I remember from the project, all the data and how much it took to track our impact throughout Crossroads Charlotte?
Sure. So a part of the you know, Act Today, part of Crossroads Charlotte was with organizations in a structure that we call the Learning Network. And in the Learning Network, organizations, institutions created and then implemented projects that were within their own mission, and you know, often reached across to other institutions to help implement them. But they all were tracked in this instrument that we called a CAP car, that basically was an assessment tool and measurement tracking, but it also enabled ongoing learning. So that data was sort of in a constant flow and enabled the effort to make adjustments as we moved along. And frankly, I think it also drove a lot of the partnership activation among the institutions and organizations, because you know, there was this realization that, you know, we as organizations, we are reporting on this same framework, and hey, it looks like you have some similar desired outcomes as mine, and I think it drove a lot of that connection.
Specifically on the 2Gen model, I know the slide went by quickly, but one of the resources that we are in partnership with is Aspen Institute and the Ascend program. We've been talking to them at great length about how does that model perhaps inform what we're doing here, and maybe one piece of the strategy when we come out on the other end with some recommendations. I think there are wonderful pieces of that certainly will come into play when we come up with these recommendations. We're also, Brookings has a social genome model, and now they've come up with a new thing called a metro genome model, which we're also looking at those, you know, the life cycle of an individual and how you impact them. And in collective impact, our United Way has a collective impact here program here, and I think it's certainly gotten a lot of great press, and we're seeing some good outcomes from it. I get a little tangled up sometimes with the jargon around collective impact and what people mean when they say that, but I would say all of the projects that we have done up to this date that we've talked about today sort of are collective impact in a way, and probably predate in some ways the terminology, but certainly that model has a lot for us to look at.
And if I can add, I guess, 2 points to this particular conversation. The first is the city, as we think about how we measure how well we are operating as a city, we've decided to not focus on the next year. A lot of our measurements and our strategic planning, we focus on 2050. Our goal is to make the changes that we want to make for the city that we want by 2050, and that's not like small incremental goals. We're talking, you know, earth-shaking, no one's done this ever before kind of stuff. I'll give you an example. By 2050, we will produce zero waste. By 2050, we will be completely carbon neutral. These are incredibly difficult goals, but that's the target that we set, and we're looking at a multi-generational time frame to get to that. The other thing that I will tell you, and I think this is unique to Charlotte, not so unique that we're the only one. There are a couple of places around the world. I only know of one other place in the U.S., and I think that's Santa Monica, that's looking at it. One of our, I guess, measures that we're looking at to really define how well we are doing as a city, we're looking at trying to measure happiness in our community. That is the ultimate goal. If our people are happy, the rest of it is pretty much self-explanatory. So that's what we're trying to do. We're still trying to figure it out. I actually have a happiness task force, believe it or not, that's looking into it, trying to figure out what this all means and how we measure it as a community. And I think, you know, it embodies the ideas of economic opportunity, education, achievement, interracial trust. That's what we're shooting for.
Denise, do you think that Project Lift has implemented the two-generation approach to the work, or primarily has been focused on the a previous question we had? I just want to make sure that we talk about it from more this is an educational project, or is it something that the district focuses more on the graduation rate?
I would say that our work around the two-generational approach is probably less mature. Our work around collective impact is where I really put a lot of work. A lot of the partners that work with Project Lift, both grant-funded and not grant-funded, have always worked in the Project Lift schools, but they've always worked in silos, and people were not talking to each other, and we had duplicative services provided to families, and we have no services provided to families. And so we've really worked to create the mechanisms and the environment for collaboration among these partners and work towards common goals. I would say we are definitely not there yet, but my vision for it is for it to be in place and up and running, because I think it also supports the sustainability, and it's the way we're going to get the work done, quite frankly.
Thank you. And you mentioned the parents that you're working with, so it allowed me to know that I know you're starting, but it hasn't completely matured yet.
Yeah.
A lot of work. This question is, I think, for Brian, because I call him the common denominator. So the question is, what would you say is the common denominator across all your projects? And how would you collectively define civic engagement as a result?
So I think, you know, if I think about the common denominators, what I would look for in Charlotte is an institution where people can bring issues and feel safe that there will be sort of a neutral place for those discussions to take place in a very rational and thoughtful and, in many cases, data-driven manner. And so that, when I've had the opportunity, I grew up in Orlando, Florida. I've been in New York and D.C. and Greensboro and other places across the country. And I think what is very unique here is the role that the philanthropic sector plays in this community. So in other communities, sometimes the philanthropic sector is sort of a second-tier partner in the community, and we're called on to provide arts and cultural things or social service, but never really at the big table to have discussions about the direction of a community. And I think in Charlotte, and hopefully in all of your communities, through sort of a demonstrated leadership role of philanthropic institutions, in many cases it will be a community foundation or something similar to that. The philanthropic sector is at the table with our key leaders and our business sector, and they're all sort of working together to figure out how to solve some of these problems. In many cases, someone is looking for the philanthropic sector to solve the problem for them and take it off of their shoulders. But in most cases, it's really a willingness to have a discussion and to go beyond just saying, well, we have a homeless problem or we have an education problem, to sort of developing these very, I think, in many cases, innovative responses to that. So for me, it's having someone in your community that can sort of be the institutional memory for everyone. In some cases, it's an actual person. In other cases, in the case of Charlotte, it's an institution where so many of these things have been going in and out. People have built up a level of trust, and that so far, to date, we haven't violated that trust. And then what we've done is we've sort of brought all this in and then deputized other people and delegated out to the community to get this really meaningful work done by the people who actually know what they're doing day in, day out. So, for instance, the foundation would never have taken on Project Lift as its own entity. Instead, we worked with our CMS, our school system, and then found a person like Denise who lives and breathes this, wakes up every day thinking about the challenges that are ahead of the school system and how to tackle them, and then when things don't go exactly right, how to unwind and figure out how to back up and go in a different direction. So to me, it's an institution with knowledge, and then good, strong, institutions and people in the community that you can deputize to move forward on some of these initiatives, while we then move on to the next thing. Because that's the one thing about the funder community, as all of you probably know, is fickle. And it's always looking for what the next thing is and how to move on. And we try to do that. We try to minimize that, but it's the nature of the philanthropic beast. And so, we need good people in the community who really think about this 24/7.
There's a follow-up question for Brian, and it says, to what extent in your test, in national in national conversations with think tanks and others, do you hear or do not hear folks talking about the cluster of cities of opportunity to focus on? Do you know of other cities doing similar opportunity task force work?
Sure, that's a great question. So we're working primarily, if you Google Richard Reeves, R-E-E-V-E-S, so Richard is at Brookings. He's sort of the guru along with Robert Putnam and a woman by the name of Erin Currier at Pew Charitable Trust. Those are sort of the leaders. Then you have others who are, I would say, those are probably more middle of the road. Then you have some more conservative folks at like American Enterprise Institute and Manhattan Institute. We're working with all of them because we're trying, again, to make this a bipartisan issue. They are certainly looking at the national level, and we've been contacted directly by Cincinnati, Chattanooga, Michigan. I'm trying to think where in Michigan, places across the country, and then community foundations as a whole. So our over the community foundation movement as a whole is looking at the issue of opportunity, because even communities that scored high on opportunity in this particular round of studies, remember that the data set began 30 years ago. And so many of those communities have changed dramatically. A place like Salt Lake City is no longer a homogenous community. They have a huge influx of low-income, especially Latinos, and so is that changing their community? So there are a lot of places that even though they scored highly, they wonder if they would score highly if they measured from today going forward 30 years. So it is an issue. Now the clusters of cities, I think the one thing that we're finding is that there is wide variety between each of the cities. So we know what the factors are, the predictors. But each of the communities is so different that it's hard to sort of say, all right, here's a magic wand. I think if you asked them, there would be probably two things they would focus on. It would be segregation, especially by income. How mixed is your housing in your community? And then the other that they would look at, many of them are looking at this issue of intended pregnancy and how, and that's not teenage pregnancy rates necessarily. That's between even 17 to 28 where people are starting to start their careers or they're in college and an unintended pregnancy diverts them from that path. And so I think those are the big common denominators, but then each of the communities is going to have its own barriers.
Thank you, Brian. I want to thank the excellent panel today. Thank you so much for your time and for your passion as we talk about this subject. I think it's an incredible opportunity for people to understand in order to create change in your community, it is important to exercise the fact that people need to have spaces so they can actually have the conversations that they need to have, that we engage and create engagement opportunities for people by actually creating an infrastructure that it could actually sustain changes in your community. And what I heard over and over again is that we have to have a convener of sorts that has institutional memory and could actually help us continue to organize us with the community faces different changes. So with that, we are going to send it back to Houston, back to Diana.
Thank you so much, Raquel. Wow, what wealth of information. I know that each of you, Raquel, Hong, Tracy, Denise, and Brian, we could have spent the whole hour and a half with just one of you and picking your brains, and we would have spent our time very well. So thank you all so much for lending us your time all together to give us a brief overview and landscape of what's been happening in Charlotte. I do want to just comment that, I myself and the folks that are here in the room from neighborhood centers, we feel really inspired about the authentic and appreciative approach to civic engagement and community engagement that you all have taken and really built on over time. It's very similar to how we think about community development here, and we're always looking for new tools in our toolbox. So we'll be following up to learn more for sure. I know that for others on the call, that some of you have indicated that you'd be willing to volunteer to host another webinar from one of our fast growth cities. So we'll be following up with you to identify those opportunities and work with you. And if you haven't or you're not sure, we strongly encourage you to think about it. We know that each of these places, it has lessons and efforts to really highlight and share. So we want to hear those stories. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Raquel, for facilitating today's webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Always welcome in Charlotte. Brian would be happy to host you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.